Hello, this video is on the date of writing for the book of Joshua. Let me share my screen. Okay, dating the book of Joshua. The picture there is of Joshua commanding the sun to stand still. Joshua picks up immediately after the end of Deuteronomy and the death of Moses. In our series on dating the Torah, we ended that at about 1406 BC. And so it's at that point that the story for Joshua picks up. The book of Joshua describes the children of Israel crossing the Jordan River, a series of military campaigns, and then a lengthy section where they apportion the land among the different tribes of Israel. It doesn't address settling the land. This becomes kind of important when we get to the book of Judges later, but every time the Israelites win a military victory, they tend to go back to their camp at Gilgal, so they don't really settle the land. It's mostly a series of military victories. Now, the authorship and date situation. There is a theory that dates the book of Joshua fairly late. It's called the documentary hypothesis. I dealt with that in painful detail in all the series that I had addressed on dating the Torah, so I'm not going to go through that again. I'll deal mostly with the traditional view, and that is that Joshua was the author. Now, if we knew for sure that Joshua was the author, then it would be an open shut case that the book was written around 1385, near the end of Joshua's life. And in fact, that's what the Talmud says. It says that Joshua is the author of the book, except for the epilogue at the end, which describes the death of Joshua, which it says was added by the priest at the time. Unfortunately, there's not a whole lot more to go on than that to describe Joshua as being the author of the book. There are a few references to Joshua in later books in the Hebrew Bible, but none of them really address the subject of authorship. The book covers just one generation in time, so you've got to go from 1406, when Moses died, to just one generation after that if you use Joshua as the author. There is this verse to consider, especially here in Joshua 24, verse 26, where it says, Joshua wrote these words in the book of the law of God. But the problem is that it's just talking about Joshua making a covenant with the people in that day. So the words that he wrote, it doesn't necessarily mean that he wrote the whole book. It doesn't mean that he didn't, but here it indicates that I think it's saying that he wrote the words of a particular covenant. And so that by itself doesn't prove that Joshua wrote the book of Joshua. Fortunately, there is another big clue that's very convincing in the book of Joshua as to when the book was written. And it's in the large number of verses which use the phrase, to this day. I'll give you all of them. There are 11 of them. In Joshua 4:9, it says that the standing stones that the children of Israel placed when they crossed the Jordan River remain in the Jordan River to this day. In Joshua 5:9, the location of their camp is named Gilgal to this day. Rahab is still alive to this day. The heap of stones remains over Achan's grave to this day. Ai is desolate until this day. The heap of stones remains over the king of Ai's grave to this day. The Gibeonites hew wood and draw water to this day. The Geshurites and Maccathites remain to this day. Hebron belongs to Caleb to this day. Jebusites are in Jerusalem to this day. And finally, Canaanites are in Gezer to this day. These verses are good evidence about when it was written, because this day is obviously the day that the story is being written down. Let's look at some of those closer. The Gibeonites hew wood and draw water. Well, the Gibeonites come back into the story of the children of Israel in the book of Samuel, and it describes what happened with Saul and with David. And that would kind of indicate that this description of the Gibeonites wouldn't carry water, if you will, much past about 1000 BC. So it would indicate that the book was written before then, or that the Jebusites are in Jerusalem. This would be an indication that the book was written before David captured Jerusalem and made it his capital. The Canaanites in Gezer. Now, later on, when Solomon is king, Pharaoh killed the Gezerites and gave the city to Solomon. That would be a little bit later, about 960 BC. So all of these verses indicate that it's a fairly early book in the second millennium BC and not really in the later kingdom period. But more specifically, you've got two, I'd like to point out two verses in particular. Hebron belongs to Caleb. That would seem to indicate that this is written down contemporary to the events that it describes. Because Caleb was the guy who was living at that time. Now, one might say that it doesn't really mean that Caleb is still alive. It may be referring to Caleb's posterity. That might be a way to read that if this was the only verse that said something like that. But in fact, it says it about Rahab too, Rahab being female. And when you wouldn't normally refer to posterity by the female name. So when it says Rahab is still alive, that would seem to indicate that, well, she's still alive even till this day when the time that the book is being written. And that would make sense if the book is written about 20 years after Jericho was conquered. Certainly Rahab could still be alive. That would not be unusual at all. But it would indicate that the book was written contemporary to the events that it describes. There are a few other hints that point to kind of an early date for it. One is that the city of Sidon is still the supreme power in Lebanon, and they're considered to be an enemy. Those verses sort of point to that. You see, later on in the kingdom era, by the time of David, in Lebanon, Tyre is the supreme city. That's a little closer to Israel, and also they are a friend. Also in the book of Joshua, there are old place names. I'll give you a list of those names. In each of these cases, there's two names there, and I only put the old names here in the list, but there's the old name and then the new name. But Joshua the book seems fit to leave you also with the old or the original name. The last one especially is telling when it says the Jebusite. That's Jerusalem there. So it's referring to Jerusalem by an old place name. And finally, there's one more thing that is quite interesting. This verse, Joshua 5:6. For the people of Israel walked 40 years in the wilderness until all the nation, the men of war who came out of Egypt, perished because they did not obey the voice of the Lord. The Lord swore to them that he would not let them see the land that the Lord had sworn to their fathers to give to us, a land flowing with milk and honey. Us. This is an interesting word because the book of Joshua otherwise is written in third person, and this is a passage where the narrator is speaking. And in this passage, the narrator slips from third person into first person when he says us. So that seems to indicate the narrator is a contemporary person there. So the conclusion that we have is that Joshua is a contemporary account to the event it describes. Whether Joshua himself was the author or one of his companions, we wouldn't really address, but it was either Joshua or someone close to him. And the date for the book would be around about 1385 BC. As with the Torah, there are scribal updates that bring some of the geographical names and the language up to date. But that's the conclusion. Joshua is written contemporary to the events it describes. And if anybody's wondering, I had the same conclusion really on the Torah, but I'll tell you right now as sort of a sneak preview, that is not going to be the conclusion for all the other books we'll look at in the Old Testament. Some it will, some it won't. But we'll go ahead and stop there on this particular video. Thank you for watching. I'll come back fairly soon, I think with another video, probably on the book of Judges.